There we go. Hello. Hello, do you hear me? So sorry about that. I introduced myself, but I was inadvertently muted. So let me do it again. This is Gonzalo Lira, otherwise known as Coach Red Pill, speaking to you live, and we are going to do our weekly webinar. As usual, could you please raise your little hands to make sure that you can hear me? Great, terrific. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I did a sound check before, and no hands went up. So thank goodness that I did, because well, just a minor inconvenience here, no big deal. The important thing is that everybody can hear me, and we are about to start. Also, by the way, can you all see the what you call it, the screen? It should say a purple background with a white margin saying the Unabomber Manifesto, and below that a subtitle as CRP Weekly Webinar. Please raise your hand now if you can see that, please. I'd appreciate it. Okay, so we're all set. Great, great, fantastic. So let's just dive into it. Okay, before I dive into it, of course, let me talk a little bit about the background of what I am doing. You see, my thinking is that at this time there are certain prohibited books. They are books that I think some of them might be outlawed in the not too distant future. I wouldn't be surprised with the way things are going. I mean, with all the statues and whatnot being torn down, people seem to be inordinately upset by symbols. And I can't even hope to begin to imagine what they'll feel like when they start realizing that certain books carry ideas that they're not really going to agree with now, won't they? Yeah. Prohibited books, books that are controversial. Yeah, I'm going to start like doing like reviews of them and discussions of them with an aim, quite frankly, and I don't have a, I'm not going to make any bones about this. I want you, my audience, you, my Patreon supporters. I mean, you guys are my diehards. I want you to be reading these books because these books, it sounds insane, but a year ago, could you imagine that they'd be tearing down statues and the authorities would be just ho hum, no big deal, and just letting it happen? Could you imagine this a year ago? Hmm? Yeah. So in a year's time, maybe they start a big old bonfire, or worse, you know, people with their Kindles, they start wiping your Kindle of any prohibited book. You know, that happened a few years ago that people bought an edition of all books, Orwell's 1984. And apparently the copyright wasn't quite right for that edition or something like that. And anyway, what happened was that the Amazon just went into the Kindle machines of all the people who had purchased the book and wiped it from their Kindle and gave them a refund. That's very nice of them. But imagine if this had been like a real book. It would have been like you bought a real book at, say, Barnes and Noble or someplace like that. And, you know, Barnes and Noble realized, oopsie, you know, we were selling a book that we shouldn't have. And so Barnes and Noble sent some agents to your house to break into your house, steal your copy of 1984, and leave a little bit of money there. You know, a little money on the mantelpiece. You know, the price that you paid, including sales tax. Wouldn't that be like creepy as all get out? Fuck yeah! And that's basically what happened to all these people. And so I personally think that a lot of books are going to be prohibited. So it would be smart to have like hard copies of them. And you think it's insane, sure, think all you want, but last year you would have thought it's insane if I told you that they're going to start tearing down statues of Ulysses S. Grant and other abolitionists because they are racists, which is what they're doing now, right? So anyway, I want to discuss several prohibited books. This is the first one. The other ones I'm going to be discussing in no particular order are The Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald, The Bell Curve by Edward Herrnstein and Charles Murray, and Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. I want to be reading and reviewing those books and discussing them seriously, discussing them on their merits. And I think it would be a useful exercise. And I'm going to be doing these broadcasts strictly on Patreon because it's a more controlled environment. The people who are here, you all, I'm pretty sure that none of you is a Fed or an SJW. I'm pretty sure that none of you is going to try to deplatform me for wrongthink. and that you'll be thinking or listening to what I have to say about these books with an open mind. One of the things I really, really like on Patreon, and I want to encourage it, is a lot of times people disagree with what I have to say in my videos or webinars or whatnot. If you disagree, say so. Because like, see, if I'm right, eventually you'll realize that I'm right and you're wrong. But if I'm wrong and you say, look, you're wrong for these reasons, then I'll realize it and change my opinion and adopt your opinion. And so, you know, it's all good for me. From my point of view, if I'm right, you're going to realize that you're wrong and you're going to change your opinions to match mine. And if I'm wrong, I'll adopt your opinion, you know? And so, yeah, all good for everybody. That's my thinking. That's why I value free speech. And that's why I am more than open to anybody who disagrees with me. Because a lot of times when you read somebody that you disagree with, you discover things about what you think that you might not have realized before. And you might discover that the person you disagree with is actually right. And therefore, you should adopt their ideas. Now, insofar as the Unabomber Manifesto, which is called Industrial Society and Its Future, written by Theodore Kaczynski, Dr. Theodore Kaczynski. This is a very interesting book. It's surprising that there aren't more books like this, in the sense of books that talk about our current society in a way that is intelligent. It's not the masterpiece that some people think it is. And we have to understand who Theodore Kaczynski is before we dive into his argumentation. I think it's very important to realize that, yes, it's perfectly legitimate and fine to listen to somebody even though they might have done despicable things. But just because they did despicable things and were considered a genius by their peers doesn't mean that everything that they wrote was genius. This book is very interesting in many ways. It has a lot of flaws, a lot of argumentative, logical flaws, okay? Because this guy talks about things that I know real goddamn well. He talks about history and he talks about philosophy. And I know both because I studied both. He was a mathematician, a smart man. I'm sure he has probably more IQ points than I'll ever have. But he was not the brainiac that everybody wants him to be, okay? So I'm just warning you from the get-go. I don't agree with everything he says, although I do believe that a lot of the things that he said are extremely insightful. Okay, let's start with his life. Now, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was born in 1942. Oops, where did that go? Huh. Wait, one moment. I have, oopsie daisy. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. There we go. Sorry. Ted Kaczynski was born in 1942 in Chicago in a typical middle-class family. He had one younger brother, and I believe a younger sister, although she never pops up much in his biography. He was identified as extremely smart from the get-go, and he was pressured somewhat by his parents to excel academically. And well, that was richly rewarded in 1958 when he was accepted to Harvard as a 16-year-old. Now, what's interesting about his period at Harvard between 58 and 1962 is that he studied mathematics and he was acknowledged to be exceptional. However, he was the subject of Henry Murray's psychological experiment on stress and ego. There is a consistent rumor claiming that he was part of the MK Ultra program of the CIA, and that he was also forced to take LSD. Both of those are inaccurate. They're just exaggerations. It's just urban myth. He was a part of Henry Murray's psychological experiment on stress and the ego, starting in his sophomore year. Now, this is actually serious, because basically he would go every week to the psychology lab, and what he was expected to do was write an essay of what he thought. And his essay, he would submit this essay of what he thought, and a lawyer would examine that, and on meeting him would basically just annihilate his argument and basically make him think that he was a fool. The whole idea was to see how much stress was necessary before the ego disintegrated. It was also how much psychological stress somebody needed before they would start to change their minds. This is a grotesque experiment because it was carried long term. See, just prima facie, this kind of experiment of basically abuse, one perhaps could justify it on a short-term basis, short-term being you go into a meeting, you have this very, very unpleasant situation, and then afterwards, immediately afterwards, you are told it was part of an experiment and, you know, no harm, no foul kind of thing. Even so, it's traumatic. Now, by the way, the experiment, what happened was that when the subject of the experiment, in this case Kaczynski, submitted his paper to Henry Murray's team, they would analyze it, and a lawyer would break it down and try to find flaws, or just, you know, out of pig-headedness, just try to say, oh, you're stupid and you're totally wrong. And when they would interview him, they would attach electrodes to his body, to his brain specifically, to measure the stress levels in his body, okay, and his brain. Now, this is abuse. It went on for 3 years, and in all, he was subjected to this kind of, I would call it psychological torture, for about 200 hours over the course of 3 years. And do keep in mind, when he started, he was 17 years old. So this undoubtedly had a profound impact on his self-conception as to who he was, okay? And to think that this experiment might have caused his criminality, I don't know if cause is the right word, but certainly contributed. Was it the singular cause? I don't know. I don't think anybody can ever know, but certainly contributed. And Henry Murray and his team were despicable. I mean, simple as that. And there's no other words for it. Anyway, he went on to the University of Michigan and got his master's in science and then his PhD by 1967. Immediately after, he went to work at Berkeley as an assistant professor in 1967. And he worked there for 2 full academic years before resigning voluntarily at the end of the 68-69 academic year, in June of 69. He went, well, here in my outline, I say briefly that he went to Montana, but that's not quite accurate. He lived briefly with his parents, about 2 years with his parents, while he was finding a place in Montana, and eventually he moved to Montana by 1971. The idea that he said was that during the 2 years he worked at Berkeley, all he wanted was to gain enough money so that he could buy a place in Montana and live in nature. During the time before he moved to Montana, that is between 69 and 71, he studied a lot of you know, survival stuff, you know, how to hunt, how to identify edible plants and that kind of stuff. So anyway, he moved there by 71, and he lived the life of a hermit hobo, if you will, which in that area of Montana, near Lincoln, Montana, was quite common. Well, not quite common, but there were enough people who lived that kind of life, of the hobo, hermit, very solitary kind of lifestyle, living on the fringes of society. In 1978, he started his first bombings, okay? Now, this was in 78 that it started, and all in all, he would carry out 16 bombings over in a 18-year period from 1978 to 1995, just shy of 18 years. During these bombings, 3 people died and 23 people were injured. All of them were random and or innocent. In a couple of cases, he knew the victims or was aware of who they might possibly be, but he never attacked them for anything that they had done to him specifically, or even for anything that they had done generally. He just attacked them because of the positions that they held. Now, these bombs were increasingly sophisticated as he got just better at being a bomb maker. And his bombing activity sort of like reached a crescendo in the early 90s, to the point where he was able to successfully blackmail the mainstream media into publishing his manifesto. The manifesto you've just read, the Unabomber Manifesto, aka Industrial Society and its Future. And it was because of the publication of the manifesto that he was identified. And it's really interesting. See, his brother David, with whom he was in contact with sporadically, read it, and he didn't think at all that it could possibly be his brother until he read a very key phrase. The phrase was, "You can't eat your cake and have it too." Now, most people say the phrase, "You can't have your cake and eat it too." But see, that's logically incorrect. It is perfectly possible to have a cake and eat it as well, but it is impossible to eat your cake and then still have it. But most people say you can't have your cake and eat it too, or you can have your cake and eat it too, irrespective. And in the case that Kaczynski was using it in his manifesto, he was using it in the negative sense. When he published the manifesto, or let me phrase that, when the newspapers that were blackmailed by him into publishing the manifesto ran it, he told them specifically that they could not alter anything in it. They could not do any kind of editorial work on it. They had to publish it verbatim, mistakes and all. Now, this was key because more likely than not, a copy editor would have changed that phrase. They would have changed it around to, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," and therefore David would not have recognized it. But David recognized it because Ted Kaczynski would pedantically insist that it's, "You can't eat your cake and have it too," and that, which is correct, but in terms of usage, it's incorrect, if you will. I mean, the majority of people who use this phrase use it incorrectly. I'm one of those pedants who tends to use it correctly. And for me personally, on a logical level, I have to admit, it annoys me when people say, "You can't have your cake and eat it too," because I just want to scream at them, "Yes, you can. You can have your cake and eat it too." But I just, of course, I don't say anything and I just go along with it. I have my internal autist, my internal OCD sort of like riles up when I hear the phrase said incorrectly by the vast majority of people. Whenever I come across anybody who says it correctly, I have this like, this feeling like finally someone like me, someone on my team, my guy, slash my guy. Yeah, exactly. So I have to admit, TK, Ted Kaczynski, Theodore Kaczynski, Dr. Theodore Kaczynski, he's my guy in that kind of being a grammar Nazi, right? The other thing, oh, by the way, just so that you know, the reason he's called the Unabomber is because he sent bombs to universities and to an airline. And the airline, it was caught, I do believe, in the post office, but it was aimed for American Airlines. It was supposed to be on a plane. It was supposed to blow up on a plane. And so the FBI, of course, they didn't have a name for him, so they called him the University and Airline Bomber. And eventually that was shortened from the University and Airline Bomber to the Unabomber. And so that's where the name comes from, okay? He himself never gave himself any kind of name, although in some of his bombs, he started to write the initials FC, which when he published his manifesto claimed it meant Freedom Club, which was the name of the group that he was supposed to be a member of, or let me phrase that, a terrorist group that had written the manifesto. When of course it wasn't a group, it was an individual, and it was Kaczynski. So anyway, he was captured in 1995. He was tried and convicted, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, justifiably so. And he has been living in a maximum security federal prison in solitary confinement in Colorado for the last 25 years. And he richly deserved what punishment he is getting, as far as I'm concerned. Because Ted Kaczynski killed 3 people who were completely innocent in a way that I, as a man, find really despicable. Because, see, if somebody comes up to you and starts fighting you with the aim to kill you with a knife or his fists or whatnot, that's one thing. But he sent these bombs anonymously, and for me, on sort of like a level of a man, I find that despicable. That murder of people anonymously, I find it truly wrong to murder people like that. Like, just to, out of the blue, send them a bomb, because it's terrorism on the one hand, but it's cowardly. I have to say that, and I know it sounds absurd because murder is murder, right? But I suppose my feeling is that there are some murders that are more unacceptable than others, you know? And I feel that um, that bombing somebody like this is just beyond the pale. You know, I can't, you know, I can't. I know it's a little silly, but that's how I feel. Anyway, Ted Kaczynski has written a couple of other things, but the manifesto is the big kahuna, as it were. The manifesto, I'm sort of unclear as to when he wrote it, or how he was developing it, or whatnot. It's clear that he wrote this version of the text in 1995, but how long was he percolating these ideas and developing them? That's obscure. Nobody really knows. So be that as it may, we can just say that it was, you know, posted in 1995. He wrote it in the months leading up to its publication. There's something else too. You have to understand that this manifesto, or other versions before it, he never tried to publish them before. He started bombing in 1978, but before 1978 and after 1978, he made no effort whatsoever to publish any ideas that he might have had. And this is really important because, see, it's not that he had good ideas and nobody was listening to him, and so he started bombing people so that they paid attention. It was just, he started bombing people. He started killing people, thinking that his random bombings would somehow bring about the destruction of industrial society, which is, of course, absurd. You can kill a whole bunch of professors and a whole bunch of different people and blow up a bunch of airlines, and our society is just going to continue on rolling along. By his own ideas, which I'll discuss in just a moment, he says that, you know, random events are not going to change any trend in history. So by his own admission, what he was doing was not going to change the trends of industrial society at all. Okay, so you know, you got to understand that on a profound level, Theodore Kaczynski was full of shit. I mean, he was just a terrorist who wanted to dress up his terroristic outrages with philosophy, and not very good philosophy at that. And we're going to get to it in just a moment. But I just want to make it really, really fucking clear that this guy is not an intellectual hero. He is a guy who, he wasn't like working on his life's work for years and years and years, and nobody paid attention to him. He tried to publish and tried to get people interested in ideas, and that didn't happen. So finally, he decided that he was going to use terrorism to get people's attention and leverage those terrorist acts in order to get his book published. I mean, that's insane as it stands, but at least it would have had a little bit of sort of like, you know, a logical, you know, cause and effect kind of thing, right? But that wasn't the case. This guy started bombing people just for shits and giggles in 1978 when he was 36 years old, a hobo living in the middle of fucking Montana, living in the fucking middle of nowhere. You know, he's not a hero, okay? I want to emphasize that really before anything, because a lot of his ideas are extremely attractive. A lot of his ideas are ideas that you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's how I felt about a lot of his ideas, okay? I mean, I'm no kidding around. But you have to always remember that this guy was a murderer, first and foremost. And he's an intellectual second. And his ideas are very compelling, some of them. Some of them are just flat out stupid, and I'm going to show you why. But no matter how compelling, you have to remember that he himself is not somebody to lionize. His ideas, some of them are interesting. And I do not believe that just because of somebody's heinous acts, you should dismiss what they have written or said or thought. There are lots of people who were just heinous bastards who wrote very well, you know? I mean, all kinds of people. So I don't have a problem with that. I mean, like, for instance, in Spanish, Pablo Neruda, who was a fucking communist Stalinist bastard, a fuckstick of the highest order, he wrote beautiful love poems, no question. Do I admire Pablo Neruda's writing? Yeah, fuck yeah. Do I think that he's a commie bastard who should rot in hell? Fuck yeah. I mean, you got to keep in mind, you can respect somebody's ideas, think highly of his conclusions, of his writings, but never forget on a moral level who you're dealing with. Okay? Okay. So let me, with that caveat out of the way, let me move on to his actual theses. Okay. Now, I would suggest if you go to Patreon, the last post I put it just about half an hour before the start of the show. I put up a summary that I was like preparing for the show and getting everything all my ducks in a row, and I came across this fantastic summary, which I posted in on what you call it on Patreon. Now, for those of you who have found it, it's from a guy called R. Butterworth, rbutterworth.nfshost.com. Raise your hand if you saw it and go to that page now. It would be handy for you to have it now. Raise your hand if you see the link that I'm talking about. I guess everybody sees it. I'm assuming that everybody sees it. Okay, good. Everybody's raising their hand. Terrific. Keep that open because it's exceedingly useful as a summary. Because I'm going to do my own summary, which is, of course, completely different because I just want to put everything on one panel. And this summary that Mr. Butterworth has created, it's very good in terms of like, okay, this is exactly what Kaczynski wrote in the Manifesto. It's very good in that regard. And you'll notice that when he goes into each chapter summary, he has a hyperlink to the from the introduction, from the name of the chapter. It goes directly to the actual text. So it's easy to compare what Mr. Butterworth is saying with the actual text and confirm that it's accurate. Because mine is it's a different kind of summary because, as you recall, I studied philosophy. And in philosophy, one of the things that we were taught was to extract the basic arguments from a text and synthesize it and present it in a way that is digestible. So my synthesis of his ideas is, of course, going to be very different from Mr. Butterworth's summary of those ideas from Mr. Kaczynski's book. All right. So, or not really book, it's more like an essay if we think about it. It's only what, 80 pages or something like that. So anyway, let me go through what I consider to be his main theses, and you just follow along. I have the entire outline here. It's just this single panel. The next panel I have is going to be my objections, okay? But before I start going into the objections, it's very important for me to nail down exactly what he means, exactly what Kaczynski is saying in his thesis, Industrial Society and its Future. Now, the first sentence is very famous. He says, the Industrial Revolution has been a disaster for the human race. Now, why does he believe that it is a disaster for the human race? Well, because he believes that it has robbed people of what he calls the power process. It has robbed people of autonomy, self-esteem, and because it's robbed them of self-respect and self-esteem and autonomy, people have become depressed and unhappy. He believes that the Industrial Revolution is the reason for people's unhappiness. Because it's robbed them of this power process. What is the power process? Oh, very simply, it's 4 stages. There's goal, effort, attainment, autonomy. The notion is that a person formulates a goal, and then they expend effort in order to attain that goal. Once they have attained that goal, there's an infusion of self-confidence and satisfaction. And that sense of self-confidence and satisfaction leads them to autonomy, which he seems to categorize as true freedom. Now, this is very interesting because it differs substantially from what other people would consider true freedom. But let me set that aside for the moment. I want to concentrate on what he means by the power process and what the goals are of power processes, okay? Because he basically says that a fulfilling life for human beings requires the power process. You cannot have a fulfilling life without the power process. And the power process involves goals that are essential for survival. That is, attaining shelter, attaining food, attaining water. Those are the true goals of the power process. Now, this is something very interesting because here he says that industrial society strips human beings of the power process because it satisfies all human beings' needs, presumably food, water, shelter, and clothing. Kaczynski believes that before the industrial society, before the industrial revolution, where they themselves had to work, had to set themselves the goal of attaining food, attaining water, attaining shelter, attaining clothing, that is when they were truly fulfilled. And that once industrial society was able to provide those things, it stripped human beings of their satisfaction, their sense of self-worth. It led them to being unhappy, depressed. Now, this is a very compelling argument, it seems, but I'll get into the critiques of it in just a moment, okay? Because let me just stick to what Kaczynski is saying. This is what he's saying about the power process. Now, he's saying that, you see, there are two kinds of people who, when the industrial society provides them with everything, they're like fine with it and they don't do anything. And then there are other people who are not fine with it. They need to expend energy in order to achieve something. And so they fall back on what he calls surrogate activities. Surrogate activities being like hobbies or pastimes or art forms or whatnot, as a substitute for the power process. They are ersatz goals that do not fulfill most people, even the ones who are full of drive and trying to achieve their goals. They're goals that are not of the power process per se. The power process, as I explained, it's like the basic necessities of survival. But since the industrial society provides that, they have to come up with these artificial goals, i.e. surrogate activities. And these artificial goals lead to the attainment of that. By way of effort, you attain these goals, and by the attainment of the goals, you feel autonomous. But Kaczynski is very clear that surrogate activities never lead to true autonomy, i.e. true freedom, because you are part of a system. The industrial society restricts people's freedoms in order to successfully operate on a systemic level. That is, the industrial society as a system requires people to be less free, which is prima facie true. Now, what's interesting here is that he says the more advanced the industrial civilization, the more restrictive it must necessarily be. Now, that is also extremely compelling because prima facie, we can see that it's true. For instance, compare the life of, say, somebody in the mid-19th century in 1850. Compare them to a life today in the year 2020. In the year 1850, there are a lot less restrictions imposed on people. And they were able to partake in the industrial civilization. Today, you need to jump through a whole host of hoops of different sorts. You know, be registered, have the right documentation, have this, that, the other, in order to partake in industrial society. And because of it, you are more and more restricted. Kaczynski goes on to say that things in industrial society are either easy or prohibited, which is actually a very compelling position, because he says that things can be either easy, hard, or impossible. Fine. But he says that industrial society will, because of its technological advances, and its technology generally speaking, will allow things to become either easy or they will be impossible, i.e. prohibited. Not because they are impossible in the sense of not being attainable, but rather because the industrial society will not allow it, because that thing that it does not allow is something that would be detrimental to the industrial society's continued existence and flourishing. This is a very interesting idea. And so Kaczynski says that as the society advances, as the industrial civilization advances, it becomes more restrictive. It necessarily becomes more restrictive because more technology, more advances, more automation requires the people to be fit into more and more restrictive boxes so that the entire system can work. This is a powerful, powerful argument. And it's, before I'm going to get into my objections in a little bit, but prima facie, it's very hard to say that he's wrong on this score. Now, what he says further is that people become, just as the society becomes more and more restrictive, people become more and more demoralized in direct proportion to the material well-being that they get out of the industrial society. Now, here, this is a touchy one, because on the one hand, it logically follows. On the other hand, the notion that people become more and more demoralized in direct proportion to their material well-being, that's not true. That's demonstrably not true. And so we come to a very interesting fork in the road here, because his previous argument, the industrial society restricts people's freedoms in order to successfully operate on a systemic level. The more advanced the industrial civilization, the more restrictive it must necessarily be. Well, that seems to be fine. But the next step, thus people become more demoralized in direct proportion to the material well-being that they get out of the industrial society, that's obviously not true. Because they can become demoralized for very different reasons. It is not in direct proportion to the material well-being that they get out of the industrial society. And so in my own case, in my own training in philosophy, I was always taught that, if you come to a conclusion that seems really wrong, don't examine the conclusion, examine the previous premise, the previous premise conclusion, and see if that one's, if there are problems there. Because if you get to a conclusion that is obviously wrong, the problem is not there. It's going to be in the premises that you accepted previously as true or accurate or valid. And so the premise that the more advanced the industrial civilization, the more restrictive it must necessarily be, that seems on the one hand to be true, but that is likely to be the problem, the argumentative problem here. And that's why it's something to be looked at a little bit more closely. Anyway, the industrial society cannot be reformed because of, like I said here, convoluted ideas about historical long-term trends. Yeah, I just have to, I became extremely impatient with Kaczynski when he started talking about historiography, okay? Let me get to the relevant, to look at the Butterworth summary. I'll tell you exactly where we have the problem. It's, yeah, when he gets to the part where it says some principles of history. Some principles of history. Yeah, if you can get to that section in the book itself, it's paragraphs 99 and onward. Okay. To read off the previous ones, there's from the beginning, there's introduction, psychology of modern leftism, feelings of inferiority, over socialization, the power process, surrogate activities, autonomy, sources of social problems, disruption of the power process in modern society, how some people adjust, the motives of scientists, the nature of freedom, and there some principles of history. Now, some principles of history, this section here, it's convoluted and stupid. Now, he doesn't know the fucking thing about historiography or historical theory. Now, why do I say that with such confidence? Well, because it was my area of specialty. I studied philosophy and history. I wrote my thesis on the Russian provisional governments, and insofar as philosophy, I did a lot of work on, well, basically modal logic, epistemology, but a special emphasis on Hegel and his ideas on history, and Hegel's history of philosophy of history. Not to be confused with history of philosophy. He wrote the two books, philosophy of history and history of philosophy. And I specialized in the one that was philosophy of history, okay? So anyway, let me, taking Butterworth's summary of Kaczynski's ideas. He says, small changes, number one, small changes in long-term trends are transitory. Changes large enough to permanently affect a trend alter not only the trend, but society as a whole. The side effect of permanently affecting trends cannot be predicted. New societies cannot be designed. People do not choose the form of their society. Okay, right there, we're having all kinds of problems. First of all, he fails to satisfactorily describe what the fuck are long-term trends. Okay, he just fails to explain that, and who defines them? Where do they come from? He just doesn't talk about them at all. And this is actually important because his failure to explain long-term trends, and point 4, new societies cannot be designed, which he explicitly says, by the way. He explicitly says in paragraph 104, he calls it the 4th principle. A new kind of society cannot be designed on paper. That is, you cannot plan out a new form of society in advance, then set it up and expect it to function as it was designed to do, which I would fully agree. But the thing is, see, later on in his argumentation, Kaczynski is going to propose exactly that, a designed society. Okay, and a designed society that ultimately will lead to the reemergence of the industrial society. But I'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, but anyway, the point I wanted to say is that, see, when you read these Some Principles of History, which is his stab at philosophy of history, it's incompetent. It's incompetent and nonsensical. He glosses over it and gets through this passage, this part very quickly. He needs to get through this part because it's necessary for his argumentation later on, because it basically argues that there cannot be reform. The industrial society cannot be reformed. He insists on this, and he needs this section in order to bulletproof that concept that industrial society cannot be reformed. By the way, you will have noticed, of course, that I skip over all that stuff where he shoots down leftists. The reason he shoots down leftists is because he wants to make it clear that leftists, who are the sector of the body politic that try to change things and reform things and improve things so that a society can continue running, he has to discredit the left in order to make it clear that the society cannot be reformed. Because if he allows room for the left to exist, then society can be reformed, and therefore his revolution, what he believes will happen or what he believes is necessary, the revolution cannot take place. Because if there's an effective left that can actually bring about change, that can actually bring about, let me phrase that, reformation, not revolutionary change, but reformatory change. If he allows that, then his whole thesis collapses. That's why he's so virulent against the left. It's not that he's quote unquote our guy. He's not. He considers the right wing fools. Well, so do I, but that's for another conversation. But the point is, he's shitting on the leftists because he has to discredit their ability to reform any system. If he allows them the possibility that they can reform a system, then his whole thesis collapses. That's why he's so virulently against them. That doesn't mean that he's wrong in his criticisms, by the way. I think that his criticisms of leftism are really, really on point, and especially there's some other stuff that we'll discuss in just a moment. But you have to understand that the reason I'm skipping over the leftism shit, it's because, yes, it's entertaining, but it's actually not very important to his overall thesis, even though he devotes a lot of paragraphs to discrediting leftists. He discredits leftists because he needs to discredit the possibility of reform. That's why he does it, okay? And though there are a lot of fireworks in those first chapters, and after all, he spends roughly 90 paragraphs shitting on the leftists. I mean, if you read it a certain way, that's what you would claim that he'd done. A lot of it has to do with that, okay? So anyway, going back to the argumentation. Industrial society cannot be reformed. That he goes through a very convoluted process to posit that. And so let's just take it as given, okay? And not try to humiliate him anymore, because he really just fails to explain it. Anyway, thus the industrial society will eventually reach one of 3 end stages. Because this is what he's arguing, okay? You have to understand that Kaczynski, he goes, he says that industrial society cannot be reformed, and ergo, this industrial society will get to an endpoint. He glosses over these endpoints very quickly in his thesis. I mean, it's barely like a paragraph, but you have to understand that this is the ultimate vision. This is where it ends. This is very important that you understand that this is the place where industrial society ends. Three options. There will be either an overpopulated planet ruled by an elite where most people have their needs met by the state. People are either indolent because of automation, or they carry out menial tasks which will eventually be replaced by automation. These people are controlled via propaganda and entertainments. Okay, now that's one possibility. That's the least bad possibility. The second possibility is that there's an overpopulated planet where all human beings relentlessly compete with one another, and so necessarily they start to alter their bodies via cybernetics or genetics in order to outcompete their peers, and eventually they cease to be human beings altogether. They become a machine-animal hybrid of some sort. All of this taking place while more and more industries are being automated, which is driving all of humanity into this, into turning into Borgs, basically. You know, Borgs, the characters in Star Trek, if you don't know what they are, they're basically like these organic robots. They're like half man, half machines. They're just machines without any kind of emotion. And they're kind of like the antagonists in one of the television shows, one of the Star Trek television shows. I'm just glossing it over in case you haven't read it, but this is what Kaczynski is basically saying. This is a second possibility. A third possibility is that you wind up with an underpopulated world, where most people have been exterminated, and you have a tiny elite living in luxury, in the lap of luxury, an entire automated planet that exists for their leisure and amusement and entertainment. That's basically the three outcomes that he outlines. This is the end state of his argument, okay? I'm presenting it in a way that you would look at his argument here as summarized in Butterworth, and you'd say, well, it's a totally different way, you know, but it doesn't really matter how he gets there. Those are the three ways those are three ends, or let me phrase it, it's not doesn't matter how he gets there, rather, this is what he's aiming for. These are the three outcomes that he envisions, okay? He's doing a lot of stuff here. For instance, in subsequent chapters to the one I discussed previously, there were some principles of history of that chapter. After that comes industrial technological society cannot be reformed because of the principles enumerated before. Restrictions on freedom are unavoidable, which is previously talked about. The bad parts of technology cannot be separated from the good parts of technology, ergo. But you see all of this slides into the future. It's all about the future. And you get to the chapter on the future. And the chapter in the future is basically, it will be very repellent is a society in which a person can satisfy his needs for power only by pushing large numbers of other people out of the way and depriving them of their opportunity for power. That's the thing that he finds repellent. A child of the Cold War, you know, because he's reacting to the Soviet Union, where you had the apparatchiks, the people at the top who did very well, and the great masses who were essentially slaves. Now, this whole notion, of course, comes from Hegel's theory of freedom, where he talked about the Asiatic dictatorships, where you had the dictator at the top and of the pyramid who was completely free, and all the slaves below. And then you had the aristocracies that had almost as much freedom as the Asiatic dictator, but less, certainly constrained, and a large underclass that were their slaves, and so on until you get to the liberal democracy, where everybody is free-ish, but everybody is slightly constrained, which is the civil society we live in, okay? Kaczynski is basically saying that, and Kaczynski's outlook for industrial society, well, what is the future of industrial society? These three, you know, either an elite with all the people who are slaves or just sitting there doing nothing, just eating up space, or you have everybody relentlessly competing nonstop and having to alter themselves in order to you know, one up one another, or everybody's annihilated and there's just an elite that's serviced by a technological class. That's basically the outcomes. That's how I read it. Kaczynski's solution: revolution is easier than reform. He says that what has to happen is there has to be an enforced return to small rural communities and a dismantling of the industrial society. That's what he says has to happen. Okay, that the only way, and the strategy is the antepenultimate chapter, or anti-penultimate chapter called strategy. That's where he talks about that. That's where he outlines it. That's what you have to do. You have to return to small rural communities, which of course can only be achieved by way of a revolution. He doesn't say necessarily that it has to be violent, but there has to be a revolution, at least revolution in thinking. But here we come to problems with his thesis, okay? Because his thesis, for all his, well, let me just get into the objections. Hang on, there you go. Okay, so the objections. The first problem that we have here is that the power process implies that the will to power is the highest desire of every human being, which is self-evidently not true. Simple as that, okay? There are lots of other drives. Principally, I would argue two that he just does not even touch. Number one is a sexual drive, the drive to procreate, which is quite obviously the most powerful drive. Because see, Kaczynski in his power process, he's saying, you know, you have a goal, you have effort, you have attainment of the goal, and therefore autonomy. And you might say, or he might say, that, well, sexual desire folds neatly into the power process. No, because see, that's not accurate. In the power process, there is the attainment of a goal, and therefore autonomy. But in the sexual impulse, there is attainment of, say, a mate, and therefore less autonomy. Because once you attain a mate and you procreate, you are necessarily limited in what you can do because you have to care for the product of your union with a woman, or vice versa in the case of a woman. You have to take care of the kid, and therefore that reduces your autonomy. And so quite obviously the power process does not fit insofar as the sexual dynamic. It also doesn't fit insofar as the need to belong. What an idea that I've been developing called reciprocity of need. We have this need as human beings to belong. And how does it express itself? Or what is this notion of belonging? Well, belonging in the sense that you are needed by others, and you in turn need others. They need you to survive, and you need them to survive. This is quite natural in a tribe living in, say, the savannas or the European forests or whatnot. See, a tribe would wander around the earth, and they needed each other in order to survive, because a human being goes through long stretches where autonomously a human being cannot survive. For instance, when a human child, when it's born in a fairly embryonic state. I mean, it literally can't do anything. It can't even walk until the age of, say, between 9 months and 18 months. And it can't eat food on its own until the age of roughly 18 months to 30 months. It needs other people to survive. And even as a youth, 4, 5, 10 years old, up to I would argue perhaps the age 10, 12, a human child cannot survive on its own. It doesn't have the knowledge, it doesn't have the energy, the capability. It's impossible for a human child to survive on its own. And women, for instance, women who are pregnant, who are severely pregnant, and who are nursing a newborn child, it is impossible for them to survive on their own. They cannot acquire enough calories for themselves and for their child. They need other people to provide those calories for them. And so this need that human beings have for one another, this need that we feel enormous satisfaction when we belong, and we yearn for belonging and strive towards it. This doesn't fit at all into the power process, not at all. And Kaczynski just ignores it. He doesn't even see this, because of course Kaczynski, insofar as his argument in the Unabomber Manifesto and the power process and the notion of it and his dismissal of surrogate activities, which were ersatz versions of the power process. Well, he's describing his own problems. He's describing his own situation that means nothing to other people who have sexual desire and who have a desire to belong. We all have that need to belong. He didn't. Therefore, he didn't see it. We all have a need for sexual companionship and procreation. He didn't. Therefore, he doesn't see it. See? And right there, the power process, it's basically the will to power in the Nietzschean sense. And that is self-evidently not the highest or most important or strongest desires of human beings. It's not. Certainly there is the urge to survive insofar as food, water, shelter. But given that, there are other desires that are far higher. And the issues of food, water, shelter, clothing, they're relatively easy to acquire. They have always been relatively easy to acquire for human beings, or else we would not have survived as a species. So the power process, no. His historical theory is laughable. He can't make a distinction between unpredictable events and long-term trends. He just doesn't define them. He doesn't even explain where these long-term trends come from. Also, what's very interesting is that his notion of history does not explain the rise of an industrial society. Where did the industrial society come from? How did it just magic onto the land? He doesn't explain that. And therefore, his whole theory of historical development it just falls apart. There's another problem too. See, his argument doesn't explain where or how industrial society arose, and therefore it leaves the door open for his own solution to devolve into another iteration of our current industrial society. Because he says that what we have to do is have a revolution and force everybody to go back to nature and to live with nature in presumably some sort of rural setting, which is I am sympathetic to. I think that it would be great to apply distributist ideas whereby we devolve from urban concentrations of people and spread out more across the land and live in small scale units. And we make the effort that we never allow any large scale institutions to grow. We always break every institution down, so make it as small as possible so that it can be as local as possible, so that we have as much diversity, true diversity, not the ersatz bullshit diversity of leftists, but I'm talking true diversity of different communities. Because my thinking, which is distributist thinking, is that if there is homogeneity across the world, then this is a potential weakness. It's sort of like, when you plant in your fields only a certain single kind of crop, then it can be the object of some pest of some sort, or some disease that can wipe out all of the food. Whereas if you have several different kinds of grain, and not only wheat and rye and barley, but different kinds of wheat and rye and barley, like a real diversity in that field, well, one disease might wipe out some of the grains you've planted, but it's not going to wipe out all of them, which is why you want diversity, which is what the distributists have been thinking about. But see, his argument, he says that we should force everybody to move to a rural setting, to live closer to nature. But see, the only way that that society will stay down and not emerge into a second industrial society is by way of force. And he himself says that that is not possible, that trying to design a society is not possible. And yet that's exactly what he winds up arguing in favor of. So you see the problem with Kaczynski's argument. He is saying industrial society is going to go down the tubes, or actually, he doesn't say that. He says industrial society is going to wind up at these possible endpoints, these three possible endpoints. Either everybody is just like miserable and living off the tit of the state, and a tiny minority are in control of everything and using the media and propaganda to control everybody, possibility one. Possibility 2 is that we become these cybernetic, genetically modified organisms, relentlessly fighting with one another for supremacy. Or possibility 3, we get this tiny elite that's supported by a technological civilization, and everybody else is wiped out for the sake of, I guess, tidiness. It's never, he doesn't explain why that would be wiped out, but that's not important in this conversation. He says that those are the only outcomes, and so to avoid those outcomes, you have to force people to become closer to nature. But he himself says that that's not possible. So which one is it? Okay. Yeah, because he has to say that it's not possible, because that way he can say it's impossible to reform. But then he says it is possible with a revolution. Like he himself said, you can't eat your cake and have it too. But he's trying to eat his cake and have it too. And finally, Kaczynski falls for the trap of thinking that industrial society will always progress. He doesn't contemplate the possibility that it decays, devolves, and collapses from its own weight. Now, this is a key issue insofar as Kaczynski's thesis. It's very interesting because Kaczynski never entertains the possibility of like a nuclear war. But then again, this was written in 1995. And even though he was a child of the 50s and child of the Cold War, by 1995, it was clear that there wasn't going to be any fucking nuclear war. Russia, the Soviet Union, was finished. And the possibility of a nuclear war was as remote as purple kangaroos popping up in your living room. So he assumes that industrial society will just continue to progress and become more and more automated. And as he himself says in his argument, he says that you can't separate the good technology from the bad. It just like progresses, geometrically into automation, into making people redundant. He doesn't contemplate the possibility that this society might relentlessly progress and at the same time begin to decay and collapse. He doesn't contemplate that possibility. And we in 2020, we see that possibility much more clearly than Kaczynski did in 1995. The fact is, in 1995, it was clearly a theoretical possibility that our industrial civilization could potentially decay, devolve, and collapse. Kaczynski didn't want to face that fact. See? He didn't want to face that possibility, because if he faced that possibility, then the notion of revolution went out the window. Then the notion of revolution would become laughable, because you'd say, well, no, you don't have to do anything to this industrial civilization. All you have to do is, wait patiently, and, you'll watch the corpse of your enemy float on by the river, i.e. industrial society will eventually collapse on its own and die and be replaced with whatever comes next. But see, he doesn't believe that. And he falls back on this prima facie nonsense of long-term historical trends, because that would be the argument that Kaczynski, the only argument that Kaczynski would have open to him, would be that, industrial society will not decay, not devolve, not collapse because of quote unquote long-term trends, end quote. What the fuck does that mean, long-term trends? Well, he'd say, it's just always going to progress. Yeah, but why? Just because is all the answer he would have. You see? You see the problem with his manifesto? So his argumentation, his theses are unsound. They are completely unsound, because he is saying that, a dystopian nightmare is the only possibility unless we have a revolution whereby we send everybody to live with nature as he was living with nature. See? And that's the key issue with this manifesto. You start reading it and you start to realize yourself, what he's really doing is explaining why he's living as he's living. He is giving a justification for the life that he is living. He's giving a theoretical justification and acting as if he's on like the leading vanguard of the future, and that he sees the future and he is living the future. The fact is, Ted Kaczynski was living as a hobo. There are pictures of him during this time, before he was arrested. Ripped trousers, just dirty, hadn't washed in weeks, wild hair, just, all over the place. The guy was a hobo. He was a brilliant hobo, certainly, no question. But precisely because he was brilliant, he could rationalize and self-justify his behavior. That's what the Unabomber Manifesto is all about. It is a very sophisticated, very intelligent rationalization and self-justification for the life that he is living. It is a way for him to explain away to himself his homicidal impulses. That's how I see it. Do I think that there are a lot of issues in his manifesto that are worthwhile? Yeah, absolutely. Lots of ideas that are really interesting. I think that his notion that leftists are fundamentally diseased, mentally diseased, is really, really on point, because he's basically saying that leftists are people who are depressed and have low self-esteem. They're basically mentally infirm people. And so they want to change society because they are outwardly projecting their own insanity. That's really interesting. And I can get behind that, fucking A. Yeah, no question. But even though I would agree with certain specific ideas, for instance, the leftism part, for instance, let me get to that section and let me, hang on, show it to you guys. For instance, this notion that industrial society restricts people's freedom in order to successfully operate on a systemic level, and therefore, as it becomes more advanced, it has to be more restrictive. That's a highly provocative idea. And prima facie, it seems to be true, even though conclusions that come from that premise seem to be false. And so there's clearly gold there, but at the same time, it could be, fool's gold kind of thing. I mean, it's shiny and pretty, but at the same time, you got to think it over. But be that as it may, there's a lot to think about here. He gives you a lot to think about. And he's a compelling writer. Nobody's saying otherwise. You have to see where he doesn't know what he's talking about. For instance, the stuff about history and historic trends and whatnot. He does not know what he's talking about. He doesn't have any kind of coherent analysis. But even if you go through the parts where he does have a coherent analysis, like for instance, the stuff about leftism and whatnot, you have to step back and realize why he wrote this. It's a justification for the life that he's living. A life that he probably grew bored with early on. And this is something that I've given it some thought. I think that what happened with Ted Kaczynski is that between 1971 and 1978, he lived this life off the grid, and he slowly started to realize that it had been a mistake. That's what I think. And as he realized it was a mistake, he had this need to lash out and a need to somehow justify this life, even as he realized it was a mistake. And that's why in 1978, he bombed his first victim. It was a need to lash out and a need to create a justification for the life that he was living, because he must have recognized that the life he was living, he was essentially a moocher. He got handouts from his parents every once in a while and his brother, and did some odd jobs when he had the brains to be a lot more than that. I think that certainly what happened to him in Harvard was horrible, but to blame it all on that no, that's not true. There are lots of horrible things that happen to each and every one of us, and it does not define us so neatly and totally, okay? I think that what defines him much more was the fact that he went out to Montana and he was there for 7 years, and he must have realized it was a huge fucking mistake. And that's why he lashed out, and he continued to lash out. And he continued to lash out to the technological society that he'd turned his back on. Why? Even he himself said that, as he put it, where'd it go? Shit, I lost it. Okay, he said that, oh yeah, you know, little things, you know, circumstantial things do not change long-term historical trends. Yeah, his efforts at killing people at random, he knew from the get-go that that wasn't going to change anything. And so it was just him expressing his rage at the destiny that he chose. And that's something to think about. Yeah. Reading this manuscript more carefully, I don't respect him. Okay. I don't respect him intellectually, and I respect him even less as I learn more. I did a video once called "The More You Understand, the Less You Forgive." Yeah, that happened to me here with this guy. The more I got to know him, the less I could forgive him. The more I recognized a fundamental cowardice in him. Because he must have realized after a few years out in Montana that this wasn't for him, and that he wasn't satisfied, and that it wasn't a life that he really wanted to be living. And rather than lash out and attack people at random with bombs, he should have just bitten the bullet and said, you know something, I'm just going to have to make my peace somehow with this industrial civilization and go back to it and get my shit together and move on. That's what he should have done. But he lacked the courage to do so. And like the coward that he was, all he could do was attack people anonymously in cowardly, low ways, which is a bomb, because it is cowardly, it is low. You know, mailed bombs, yeah, it's just as cowardly as you can get. It's like poison, yeah, because it's impossible to prevent it. You don't give your opponent you don't even give him the dignity of being able to fight back. Because like I said at the beginning of this, you know, if you attack somebody directly, you know, if some assailant comes at you with a knife, you know, you see him coming at you with a knife and you can fight him or turn and run away, depending on circumstances, depending if you yourself are armed or whatnot. See, but you know, the knife wielding assailant is signaling clearly, communicating clearly, I want to kill you. I'm coming for you. You decide whether you fight or flight, right? But here I am. I have the guts for you to see who I am attacking you. But a man who sends mail bombs is a coward. He doesn't have the courage to show himself, to show what he's doing, his intentions. I don't respect him. It was a really interesting thing because, you know, at the time in 1995, rather, when this all happened, I was, what, 27 years old? And I vaguely followed it. I didn't think much of it. I didn't read the Unabomber Manifesto at the time. And so I didn't have any real opinion about the whole situation. Now, I think so little of the man. So very little of him. I think that he was just really despicable. You know, and that's my thinking. And if you disagree, well, that's your prerogative. You know, everybody has their own opinion, and with that, I think that it's time to hear your opinion. So let me, as usual, what we'll do is let me pop out the questions dialog box and start looking at it. And question: how to? Okay, Chris. Wait. Let me. Wait. Yuri, I've never spoken to Yuri, so let's have Yuri on. Yuri, I'm unmuting you. Are you there? Hello? Hello, Yuri, are you there?
Hello?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, thank you. Nice talking to you for the first time too.
It's a pleasure.
First of all,
you had a great question here. So when you talk, I'm sorry, you were going to say?
Yeah, since it's my first time talking, I would like to say thank you for all this work that you're doing. It's very educational. And yeah, I personally think that I was missing such kind of perspectives on things in life from other people.
Thank you. I'm so glad. I'm so glad that it's helping you out.
So my comment was that I think that Ted Kaczynski wanted to choose science as his surrogate activity because when he did a PhD, was a professor for 2 years, but he probably failed to adapt the values of the academia and the way it forces people to compete with each other, because I'm a PhD student right now and I experience a similar thing. So for him, probably this was a step on his freedom, that he didn't choose the way he wants to conduct his science, for example.
That's
And
really
that's why
interesting.
he
By the
started
way,
to reform.
what kind
Yes,
of PhD are you getting? What subject?
computer science.
Okay, yeah. So you're thinking that he was unable to conform with the demands of academia, and and you're saying here he didn't have enough vanity to keep himself motivated. That's
Yeah, so
interesting. Go
this a
ahead.
certain way. This a certain way. So this already fixed structure. The way you need to conduct your research, publish your research, and I find it personally very suitable for people with lots of vanity that feel proud of their name being some paper, that other people cite that paper, and he probably fundamentally realized the limitation of people's needs. Like he lived this, how is it, hobo life, that he sees that you just need very little in your life, like a little bit of food, little bit of sleep, and all this extra competition, it was not necessary for him.
It could
So that's
be.
probably.
You do know that he published, and I didn't mention this when I did his bio, but he published a number of papers after he got his doctorate. He was, he was on the career ladder. He was doing fine. So you think that he just didn't have enough vanity to keep on going? That's an interesting idea.
I think he didn't see much meaning in this way of work, like publishing papers. He probably didn't feel enough impact on the world.
I think that you're true. It's very interesting, this notion of him putting down surrogate activities. Because in my own case, when I first read that, I was thinking to myself, well, there are lots of activity. All of my activities could be defined as quote unquote surrogate activities, but I find myself just completely enraptured in them. And so I didn't quite see what he was talking about and didn't quite believe it, didn't quite buy it, And so it's interesting ideas. It gives you a lot to think about, but like I said, I'm not too clear about it. Anyway, Yuri, thanks so much for your perspective. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for giving me a talk.
Yeah, I hope to see you again next week, man.
Sure.
Next week we'll be talking about something easier. We'll talk about naked chicks. Yeah, I'll just do like a whole presentation with like naked chicks, like, Playboy or Penthouse centerfolds or whatever the fuck, and we'll discuss that. Yeah, let's do that. Raise your hand if you want me to do that next week. No raised hands? Oh, a few. Okay. So, okay. I'm just teasing, of course. Let me go through the questions here. You're gonna have to forgive me, of course, because I'm my own producer. So I have to what you call it? Ask. Oh, is my volume low? Oh shit. Well, it's way late now because I've done most of the talk, but I hope it's not too low. Let me just check something really quick. Hello. I'm yeah, the Macintosh does like the automatic thingamajig of my volume, so I can't really do anything about it. Anyway, let me go to another question. Um, wait, I'm looking for a question here. Hang on. Okay, volume is fine. That's good to know. Oops. Jesus, man, I wish I had a producer. I wish I had a producer who could like feed me questions right into my ear, and it would be all easy, and it would be like a smoother show. So you're gonna have to forgive me, because that's what happens with a do-it-yourself show. Um, mm, 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 mm. Oh, well, here's something that Sebastian Mendo says. He says most Latin American writers are a bunch of fucking commies. That's actually not true. I'll have you know. Like Mario Vargas Llosa, look, the major writers in Latin American literature over the last 100 years, they're basically four. There's Pablo Neruda, who was a commie. There's Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was like a commie as well. But there's also Jorge Luis Borges, who was hard right. I mean, he's, you know, he was buddies with Pinochet. And there's Mario Vargas Llosa, who's also right wing, though not quite as hard right wing as Borges was. But in Latin American literature, there's more different kinds of writers, politically speaking. There are not all lefties. In American writing nowadays, they're all fucking lefties. I mean, like serious writers, right? But yeah. Let me see. Wait, what are the questions you guys have? Anybody have a question or comment? Okay, let me hit Chris O. Chris O. Hello, you there? Hello, Chris. Chris, are you there? No, let's see if just give him a minute to see if he fixes his mic. Chris, are you there? I guess not.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
Oh, there you are.
I am, Coach.
How's it going? Pretty good. Yourself?
Going very well.
Okay, so what's on your mind?
Quite well. Well, first of all, if you're gonna touch upon if you're gonna talk about naked next week, please provide some material beforehand, some PDFs we can study in preparation.
Yeah. I will. I'll send around like a whole stack of PDFs. You know. Yeah. Okay. What's on your mind, man?
Well, first of all, I'd like to comment to Yuri on his comment about the academia, as I've also spent some time at university, and it's a lot of frustration for those, especially these days and these leftist times, for anybody who has initiative, anybody who has desire to progress, especially if they're not in a minority. That definitely is very frustrating academia right now. I have two questions, a small one and a big one. The small one is, he mentioned about dictatorial nations that may take advantage of, reformed or weakened nation to invade them or take control of it. What do you think about this, and how could this apply these days with China or other nations waiting for what's happening in the U.S. to kind of settle down?
Well, what he was referring to was to answer that one real quick. He was referring to Russia, to the Soviet Union, because as a child of the Cold War, he was very knowledgeable of what was going on in the Soviet Union, and he would have recognized, as most people did, that the Bolsheviks had come into power claiming all kinds of stuff that they were going to do to help the worker. They were going to help, trade unions and whatnot. And then when they came into power, they just totally threw that overboard and became a dictatorial nation. And that's what he was talking about. That's what he was referring to. And he was saying that how to defend against it.
How would you interpret it now with China being the main contender and it handling its domestic disputes in Hong Kong very differently than the U.S. is handling its domestic disputes right now?
Well, China is actually less stable than the United States, because China is basically ruled by a minority, the Chinese Communist Party, and most of the people basically work for them. Whereas in the United States, you can argue truthfully that there is a substantial portion of people in the United States who are essentially happy with the status quo. Whereas in China, you have a minority who's happy with the status quo. And so because of that, eventually the majority is going to turn on that minority. And in the United States, we have minorities that are making all kinds of trouble, but I'm coming to the conclusion that the majority who like the status quo and don't cotton to a lot of the things that the extremists are doing right now, they're going to overwhelm them in the election. And the key issue, of course, is that, see, in the United States, the majority does have the possibility of political expression, imperfect though that political expression may be, whereas in China, they don't. And so in China, the Communist Party has a greater need to repress compared to the United States. Yeah.
But could one argue that China is already like scenario one in his vision? Isn't China already an overpopulated nation ruled by an elite where most people have their needs met by the state and they're very distracted?
Well, no, that's not true. That's not true. Their needs are not met by the state. Because you think of communist countries like Russia, where the state did provide like housing and whatnot. In China, it's more of a dog-eat-dog kind of world. The state is not providing for the welfare of the people, not the way like other socialist states did. And so that causes more uncertainty and instability in the population. Okay, so it's really not closer to what Kaczynski envisioned. It's actually in many ways farther away. You see?
Even though the Chinese population is very restricted, it's very brainwashed, and it's very, entertained in their own little world, that they don't even think about any concept of revolution. I mean, they're post the revolution desire phase. Any dissent is it's very quickly,
I beg your pardon? I didn't quite catch that.
I mean, the Chinese population is very repressed and it's very controlled. They're post any idea of revolution. That doesn't even enter their minds, and if it does, it's very quickly caught by the state.
Yeah, well, eventually that amount of repression, it's unclear. How can I put it? My problem with Kaczynski's ultimate aims of industrial society is that since so many of his premises, to my way of thinking, fall flat or are lacking, I don't really buy his conclusion that there are only these three possibilities. And therefore, I don't really try to see if I can fit an existing state to one of these three endpoints that Kaczynski outlines, because I just don't believe it. Okay. I just don't think that he's correct. I think that his argument is flawed, and I especially point to the historiographic argument, the philosophy of history argument of these quote unquote long-term trends. He just doesn't define. He just posits them. He just says, "Oh, it's like that." And at the end of the he has this paragraph where he says, well, this is just generalized, and of course a lot of it has to be filled in and whatnot. But he spends an awful lot of time, for instance, filling in about the leftists, right? And just shitting all over the leftists, which, like I said, I'm down with that. But if he had taken that kind of care and attention to the historiography stuff, then I'd be able to say, well, yeah, maybe these three options are the endpoint of an industrial society, and therefore we should look to existing societies like the Chinese society, like the American society, and see how they fit and compare to this theory. But since I think that his theory falls flat, I don't really see much of a point in trying to fit what's going on in China to Kaczynski's theory, because I think the theory is really wrong, and I explain why. I hope I've explained why. You see my point? It's sort of like when you have a flawed theory, and you see quite clearly why it's flawed, why the premises do not lead to the conclusions outlined, then why bother trying to fit reality to conform to a theory that you already believe is discredited?
Yes.
See, that's my attitude. And so I see your point that you're trying to see, well, does China fit in Kaczynski's model? But I think that Kaczynski's model is wrong. That's the problem. See, if I thought that it was right, or if I thought that maybe it's right and maybe it's wrong, but there's enough of it right that let's take it as a given, then I'd make the effort. But as it stands, no. It's sort of like, look, Hegel has this theory of historical development. He talks about the development of freedom. He essentially says that history is an evolution of human freedom. And it starts with the Asiatic dictatorship, where you have the dictator at the very top of the pyramid who's completely free. He can do whatever he wants, okay? And the entire rest of the population are his slaves. Right? He gives them certain prerogatives, perhaps, but they're not even freedom. They're all his slaves. But then you have an evolution in history, says Hegel, whereby more and more people earn their freedom. And he says that there have been different stages. For instance, the Magna Carta in the UK was when the nobles started getting rights that could not be stripped from them by the king. For instance, the right to trial by peers and such. And so slowly, different classes started earning rights, either stripping it away from the top or the higher echelons, or those higher echelons devolving that freedom, those freedoms, to the lower echelon. It doesn't matter if it was by force or if it was granted. The point was that the freedom started percolating down the pyramid, but as it percolated down the pyramid, each successive level had to accept certain restrictions so that the other members of the class could be free. That's basically Hegel's argument. And Hegel says that at the Battle of Jena, and for reasons that are obscure at this point that I've frankly forgotten, he said that that's the moment when everybody was free. Everybody became free. Feminists would argue that that's not true because after the Battle of Jena, women did not have political rights, and so okay, fine. Let's argue there was 1919 when I think it was 1919 or 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed in the United States, where women were given the right to vote. Let's say that that was a moment. Look, it doesn't really matter. The point is, see, Hegel's theory goes that as freedom percolates down the social pyramid to the lowest level, everybody's freedom becomes more and more restricted so as to accommodate more freedoms for the lower classes. Now, you can agree or disagree with this theory. There are a lot of issues with it that I disagree with that I'm not going to get into now because it's too long and it's besides the point. But the point I'm trying to make is that, see, his theory makes logical sense. And all of the premises, or most of the premises that he uses, you could argue that, yeah, they kind of like do make sense. I mean, if you're being just looking at it as sort of like serious, trying to catch any obvious flaw, but basically sympathetic, Hegel's argument works. Therefore, you should study Hegel's argument on freedom and compare it to real countries or real societies. But Kaczynski's doesn't. And that's the point. That's the point about a theory. If a theory, you realize it does not follow, then it's pointless to keep entertaining it. It's interesting insofar as the sub-arguments are concerned. The sub-arguments of Kaczynski's manifesto are very, very interesting. But the overarching thesis, and no, doesn't work. Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps you allow me to ask the big question, and that concerns.
Sure, shoot. Sorry.
It concerns population. This is one of the biggest issues I have with it, because he, on technical reasons, on moral reasons, he doesn't expand about population. What is overpopulation? What is the underpopulation? What is depopulation? And the fact that he takes it as granted that, as he calls it, there will be a time of chaos, time of crises, where what, 80% of the population must die, even in the revolution, because of poverty, because of famine. So how do we reconcile the need for fight for freedom at the same time and almost inevitable suffering and death and reduction in the population?
Yeah, well, there's another flaw with it, because see, when he talks about overpopulation or underpopulation, like you said, he doesn't define them. So it's reasonable to say, oh, a planet is overpopulated because there's not enough food. That's one metric of overpopulation. Today, do we have that problem? No, we don't. See, because Malthus argued that there would come a moment when the population would grow so much that the land would not be able to provide enough food for everybody. But what has happened, of course, is that there have been technological innovations whereby the arable land does provide more than enough food for the current population and for the population in the foreseeable future over the next 100 years. There's no doubt about that, because we've just gotten better at agriculture. Just as there's been, technological progress insofar as computer chips, there's been technological progress insofar as farming is concerned. Of course, not so great a character as with computer chips, but it doesn't matter. The reality is today, the world can produce more than enough food for the entire population. If there are starving people anywhere, it has nothing to do with a lack of food production. It has everything to do with warfare or political mismanagement or deliberate starvation of a certain populace, okay? And so the Malthusian argument of overpopulation, it does not hold today. And in point of fact, in 1995, that Malthusian argument didn't hold, because there were places that had starvation in 1995, but those places that were starving, it was because of war or pestilence and an inability to get food supplies to that particular region. But in the aggregate, worldwide, there was plenty of food in 1995. There has not been a real famine in the world since probably medieval times or earlier, perhaps. because the world has always been able to produce enough food and will likely continue to because of the knowledge that we currently have. Knowledge that, by the way, is not it can be independent. Okay. So anyway, the point here of him when he says overpopulation, he doesn't define his term, and because he doesn't define his term, it's just vague that allows him to come to conclusions that don't seem reasonable. See, he says that the world will be overpopulated and everybody will be miserable, but you know why? And what do you mean overpopulated? That is, there won't be enough. There will be so many people that there won't be enough food for all of them. Or are you? What you're really saying is there are going to be a lot of people, and I don't like a lot of people. I like my land sparsely populated, which is radically different. Okay, it's a personal preference, and you know, and that's the thing. That's the thing that I recognized. I think it was halfway through this manifesto. I realized that he's writing it to justify himself. Even his stuff about hating leftists and whatnot, it felt to me that he had some run-ins with leftists and hated them and wanted to just shit on them. Okay. And in Montana, there are a lot of leftists, you know, which is kind of surprising. You'd think, you know, people are so outdoorsy and all the rest of it, and they own their guns and they love their Second Amendment. But no, there are a lot of lefties out there, a lot of thoughtless lefties, you know, stupid lefties. So he must have come across more than one. It must have driven him up the wall. And I think that that's why he wrote all that shit about lefties, you know? Do I agree with that shit? Fuck yeah. I think it's funny, actually. Do I think it's philosophically and intellectually valid? I think parts of it are, when he talks about how he thinks that leftists are essentially maladapted. Yeah, I can see that very clearly. And that they are expressing their frustrations and powerlessness by way of their politics. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that very, very clearly. But, you know, the other stuff, no. Yeah.
The most disturbing thing I found in this essay, in his own logic, but also in leftist, is that disregard for human life, that the willingness to sacrifice whatever portion of the population for the ideology. And that's what happened during the Bolshevik Revolution with the gulags. And this is potentially what could happen in these days. I mean, you mentioned about, you know, concentration camps being raised after the elections. And this disregard.
I'll tell you, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is what is so disturbing about the left. And I'll tell you the origin of that. I'm actually putting out a video on Monday, I think it is, about this very topic. See, I'm right wing, okay? Now, I personally think that I try to be a good person. I try to do good things. Sometimes I do bad things. Sometimes I do extremely bad things. But I constantly, whenever I have the choice, I try to pick the good. Now, how do I consider myself? What do I consider myself? Do I consider myself a good person? No, I don't consider myself a good person. I consider myself a person who sometimes does good and sometimes does bad. And I'm a person who tries to do more good things than bad things. But a left-winger thinks of himself as good. I am a good person. Ergo, if I do something, it is good because I am a good person, and therefore my actions are coming motivated by goodness. You see? And therefore, if I decide that I'm going to kill every one of you because it would be good, this is not a bad action. It's a good action because I'm good. You see? You see the terribleness of that outlook? And that's what's going on with leftists. They think that they are good and therefore their actions are necessarily good. And here's more. If I think that I am good, then my opinions are the right opinions. They are good opinions because I'm a good person. Therefore, if you disagree with my good opinions, then your opinions are bad opinions. You are bad because I am good and my opinions are good, but you disagree with my opinions, therefore your opinions are bad. And if you hold these opinions, these bad opinions, then you are bad. And therefore, I should silence you. I should deplatform you, I should expunge you, I should destroy you, I'd be perfectly justified. I mean, in the hypothetical that I actually believe this nonsense, I would be perfectly justified in destroying your life because, after all, I'm good and you disagree with me, ergo, you're bad, which is crazy. Of course it's crazy, but that's a leftist mentality. And that kind of leftism that, that I'm sort of describing here, Kaczynski captures it pretty well in a lot of ways, you know? Yeah, I think also, by the way, I think that a lot of people on the political right want to like Kaczynski because of those chapters on the left, because he's essentially accurate. But just because he's accurate on a couple of things doesn't mean that his entire argument is accurate. And just because he's accurate in one description of leftism doesn't mean that he is a good person. He's not. He's a fucking awful, awful human being. Or let me phrase that by what I said before. He committed unforgivable acts. They were justified? No, they weren't. It's understandable perhaps why he did them, because he was crazy or whatever, it doesn't matter. He did unforgivable acts that were really evil. Okay, so yeah, that's my thinking on the guy.
Thank you, Coach, and I hope that you explain in the upcoming video how to defend against this kind of leftism and how to fight it out, because it might only get worse. Thank you, Coach.
Oh, I'll tell you right now, we're getting to the point where the leftists have gone insane and they no longer listen to reason. I'll say this, and this might be a controversial opinion, okay? But see, you know when a dog gets rabies, right? Dog gets rabies, and it's a disease that affects their brains, right? And once it starts affecting their brains, there's no cure. There's nothing to be done. You gotta either get away from the dog or put that dog down, because that dog is only going to attack you, attack you, attack you, attack you. And of course, it's a rabid dog. It's not going to stop. And so ultimately, you have to put him down. See, and so I think that there are some people who have become rabid, and I don't see a way to get them to stop being rabid, you know?
The problem is that a lot of these people are a big portion of the young generation. It's
too
late to educate them. It's too late to, especially the universities. I mean, we're talking more of a majority of a generation or two. So how do we re-educate them or cure them? Or
I have no idea. I have no idea, Chris. But anyway, listen, great talking to you, man. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for attending. I appreciate it. Yeah, and catch you next week, I hope.
Of course.
Okay. Kian has an interesting question here. Let me get to Kian. Kian, are you there? How's it going?
Yes, hello.
Hello, how's it going?
Things are good. Things are normal here. Quite mellow.
Yeah, because you're in Nairobi, right?
Correct. Just remember, Kian Koji from Kenya, KKK. Can't forget it.
Okay, I'll remember that the next time. How have you been, man? Yeah, how's things in Nairobi?
Usual stupid mask rules. You can't have 3 people in a car. They force you to wear masks outside. Yeah.
Oh God, yeah, it's all bullshit. It's all theater. That's the thing that drives me nuts. It's all theater.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, you had a question about Kaczynski. Hit me.
Yeah, I do. So I read somewhere that Kaczynski had he was an incel. He had a lot of sexual frustration. There was time he tried to have a sex change, in fact, because he believed he'd be the only woman he could touch or something. Did his sexual frustration have something to do with his killings, you think?
I don't know. I don't think that it's possible to really know. Perhaps, but I don't think that even he would be able to give a straight answer to that. Because I mean, you got to understand, think about the level of insanity that we're talking here, where he's deciding to make these bombs. I mean, think about it. Have you ever done some activity thoughtlessly?
Yes.
Like for instance, nothing controversial. Suppose you watch some video, right, on YouTube, and you watch it and it's not bad, but then you sort of casually hit the downvote, It's not a bad video, but you're just like, yeah, fuck it. And you hit the downvote. It was just a thoughtless little thing and no big deal. And it was like like an instant of like this. Perhaps you were feeling a little cruel. Perhaps you were just pissed off at whatever, you know. And so you hit the downvote on that video. Yeah, it's a short, trivial moment. But building a bomb takes a long goddamn time. The bombs that he was making, it wasn't that he just like sort of like accidentally like click hit the little, you know, thumbs down button. No. It took a long time. He had to get a lot of equipment and mix chemicals and get it all organized. Now, have you thought to yourself, when you're doing something long and involved, that sometimes, you know, maybe a third of the way or halfway through it, you sort of like wonder to yourself, is it worth doing this? And you go over why you're doing something, the motivation of it and whatnot. And sometimes you might abandon it because you realize, oh, you know, this is a bad idea. Or sometimes you might say to yourself, I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Or sometimes you say to yourself, no, this is a good idea. I'm just going to march forward, right? But see, when you're building a bomb, you know you're going to kill somebody. That's the whole point of it. So he had plenty of opportunities to think it over and like take a step back. And he didn't. He just marched forward. So my thinking is that he was just an evil. I mean, I think that he did evil things, and I think that the evil he has committed colors how I view him in a way that can never be changed. I can never view him as anything other than a man who is a murderer. And I can listen to his ideas and engage with them, no question, because they are very interesting ideas. And it would be nice if more thoughtful, intelligent people were to write essays like the Unabomber Manifesto. I mean that sincerely, because it would be great to have more people, you know, talking about these kinds of things. And I think that a lot of his, you know, sub-arguments are very compelling and very interesting. But bottom line, I think he's full of shit. And I think that because of his murders, he's just, no. As to whether they all originated from sexual frustration, I don't know. But the fact that he speaks so little about sex in his manifesto leads me to conclude that he wasn't an incel necessarily, but just an asexual person, a person who didn't put much stock in sexual contact. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but there was so I get my information because I watched this video from Biographics, you know, that YouTube channel. Yeah. They had this quote where Kaczynski actually said that he never thought he'd be able to touch a woman because I don't know, they wouldn't like him or something.
Okay, I never saw that, and I never read anywhere of my own reading of Kaczynski's life. I never saw anywhere that he considered getting a sex change operation. Okay, so I don't know about that. I don't know. What I do know is the manifesto itself. Chat, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that he ever referred to sex in the manifesto, did he?
Well, wouldn't that be more telling though if he didn't refer to sex? Because that would tell that he's actually trying to hide from it.
No, not necessarily. No. It could be just he just ignored it. You know, I mean, it was just, look, there are some men who simply do not have any kind of sex drive. And the thing that I've noticed is that the men who are celibate, but involuntarily so, they tend to take care of their appearance. I'm thinking of Soldini, for instance, the man who shot up that yoga studio or whatever, that guy who was like 42 and he had been an involuntary celibate all of his life. He took care of his appearance. He dressed nicely. He was trying to make himself attractive to women. Whereas Kaczynski obviously didn't. I mean, he looked like a bum. And so that's why I think to myself that maybe he was just asexual, you know? And you have to be open to that possibility, because just because you and I might be very sexual doesn't mean that every man is like that. There are some men who it just doesn't emerge in them. They don't feel it. It's not like a big deal, you know? And like Yuri said before, that a lot of academics are driven by vanity to see their names on papers, yeah, published papers, of course. And Kaczynski didn't have that. You know, again, he didn't have that kind of vanity. Perhaps he didn't have that kind of sex drive. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah,
I
I see.
personally think that he was a less motivated individual. He was a man who did not have much drive for anything, you know, because I don't think that he was lazy. I think that he was just, he had a lot of brains, but he didn't have an engine driving him forward. Because if he did, I think he would have engaged more in society and not locked himself up in Montana. You see? I think that he might have wanted to, but he was not lazy, because lazy is not the right word. He just didn't have much drive, you know? That's my thinking, you know?
Right.
I think he's a fascinating guy. But again, you know, it's not something I want to hang out with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else, Kian?
Yeah, well, one more thing. I'll be quick. Last webinar, there was a guy from Lebanon, and you told him, you know, try out Africa to, you know, travel to, and he asked you any countries you'd recommend, right?
Yeah, and I said I didn't know. I think I
Oh yeah,
said that.
well, I'll give up back. First of all, take language into account. Remember, it's either English, French, or Portuguese here, and you have to figure out first which country speaks the language that you speak. Second of all, if we are talking English, Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana are some good options. Places to avoid: South Africa, Zimbabwe, and as right now, unfortunately, I'd say Tanzania. Tanzania also has a kind of socialist past with a chip on its shoulder, and they're favoring more Swahili than English, unfortunately. So
Okay.
yeah.
What in South Africa? It's getting dark.
What dark? No. So South Africa is like really, you know, they have this chip on the shoulder, the whole farming
No.
issue.
I meant, yeah, I know, but I mean, like in South Africa, things are getting complicated. Things are getting heavy, right?
Oh yeah. No, they're getting worse. And look, you can travel to South Africa and be safe for the most part. Don't get me wrong. My sister's studying there right now, but you know, I wouldn't make a living there as of now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea to go there and start a business if you're not black. And it's actually, even if you are black, because the South Africans, actually, the local blacks are discriminating against Zimbabweans coming and finding jobs there.
Yeah, but don't tell that to the blacks in the United States, because they don't believe that black people can be racist to other black people.
Yeah, but Kenya's the worst. I mean, we have tribalism everywhere. People don't think of themselves that way. Like, all the tribes hate each other. Kikuyus, Luos, Kambas, they all have different names.
Yeah, I know. That's a funny thing. That's a funny. That's why it's so funny. You know, I mean, it's just screamingly funny as far as I'm concerned. That
Yeah.
that Africans, they all hate each other
Yeah.
on tribal levels, right? But in the West, they think that, you know, everybody in Africa is like singing Kumbaya and all around a campfire and just singing songs and passing s'mores between each other. It's really absurd, but it's pretty funny. Yeah.
I'll tell a black man, if, like, you know, if he's in the West, I can check by his like features, like what tribe he'd be considered from, you know, just by the way he looks. Like, if you move to like Kenya, people will treat you differently. Like, people from this tribe will accept you more because, you know, you look like them.
You know, I got to go to Africa. You know, I got the bike to go. I got I think I told you guys that I bought myself an adventure bike, like a big BMW 1200. So yeah, I should ride down there. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
great talking to you, Kian. Yeah,
Thanks.
we'll talk more. We'll talk more. Yeah.
Yeah.
So take it easy, man. Let me hit here. Art has a question. Art, let me find you. Art, here you are. Let me unmute you. Art, are you there? Hello, Art, are you there?
Hey, Coach.
Hello? How's it going?
It's going well. Just keeping up with the news. A lot of crazy stuff happening here in the U.S.
Oh yeah, tell me about it. Is it ready for the revolution?
Yesterday in Stone Mountain in Georgia, did you
Yeah.
hear about the NFAC? It's a black group
Mm,
militia. They went ahead and protest,
yeah.
demanding to take down the Confederate statues. They
And
were armed. I just found that alarming since
oh
them being
yeah,
a
that,
black
that that
militia.
was like it was basically a Black Panthers 2.0, right? Yeah.
That's the
I
way
I
I'm
saw that.
seeing it. That's the way I'm seeing it right
Yeah,
now.
yeah, we're getting ready for the race war.
Uh,
Oh,
uh, in my opinion, all it takes is just Black Panther, them, the Black NFAC, and Black Lives Matter to team up, and we'll be seeing something going down. That's what I'm predicting. So
This
I
is,
don't know how. Yeah, it's
this is
crazy.
like the eve of destruction, man. This is like, yeah, we're getting to go off a cliff. Look, I think that what's going on, quite frankly, has, I think actually Donald Trump might have played his cards very well because I'm not a fan. You guys know that I'm not a fan of Donald Trump by any stretch of the imagination. But my thinking is that that what you call it, uh, him not doing anything during all these disturbances has radicalized the normies. The normies are like, what the fuck is going on? And I think that they're going to come to the conclusion that only Trump can save them, and Biden he's a black hole because he's suffering from dementia, you know? So yeah. But
Well, I think it's
hello?
gonna be in. I think it's gonna
Hmm?
be interesting how this one plays out, because the Black Panthers, from what I understand, they were dismantled by the president, which they created. The SWAT was
Yeah.
created to take down the Black Panthers, and you
Yes,
know
it
how that
was.
and you know how that played out, right? The
Yeah.
deadly shooting. But
Yeah.
I don't know how this president that's gonna come in, or the government is gonna be able to take down this, or just let them play along and see what happens.
I don't
So
know. I have no idea how it's going to play out. Yeah. So anyway, great talking to you, Art. Yeah, I appreciate the call. Yeah. Look, by the way, just to round out the thought, I think that the left, the political left, the Democratic Party, they are realizing at some fundamental level that the anarchists and the hard left people have gone too far. And I think that they're scared at this point and don't know how to stop them. Because I think that there isn't any strong leadership at the Democratic Party. And so as things get worse and worse and worse, it's only going to hurt the Democrats come November. But that's what it looks like now. Things could change. Holy shit. Okay, whatever that was, I'll mute you, Art. I'll catch you next week. Hello?
sounds good, coach. Yes, sounds good. All
Okay. Okay, take it easy, man.
right, bye.
Okay, guys, I'm going to I have to admit that I'm a little bit my brain is a little bit fried from this because I realized as I was doing this that this is the first time that I've engaged like with a philosophical text, seriously engaged with it since quite a while now, and I have to admit that I'm a little bit pooped out. So yeah, I'm going to call it a webinar if you all don't mind. We've gone for a couple of hours, and I know the presentation ran for about 75 minutes. And I hope that you all enjoyed this presentation. And I think the thing that worries me the most is I don't want you guys to think of Ted Kaczynski as like this big intellectual hero. I think that there are other people who are more deserving of accolades. I think that he had interesting ideas. But, like I said before, the more you understand, the less you forgive. And getting into this and studying Kaczynski, I have come to the conclusion that he is just not somebody that I respect as a man. And his ideas, some specific sub-arguments that he has, I think are valuable. But overall, he's not the thinker that he purports to be. And if anybody claims that he's a big brain, they're wrong. I think he has a lot of interesting sub-arguments, specifically the stuff about leftists that I recommend. But for the most part, I think he was off base for the reasons I outlined in this presentation. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Next webinar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, it's going to be an open webinar in the sense of like I'll post, I'll put up a post asking for ideas and topics that you want me to discuss. I'll post that probably on Thursday. I hope that you guys will put up any ideas you want me to discuss on Thursday as early as possible so I can prepare for them. And always remember that if you see an idea that you like, give it a thumbs up so that I know the relative interest of the different topics that are posted, that are put in the comment section of the post. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. It's always so nice to talk to you guys. It really is, because I don't have the opportunity to talk to that many people, quite frankly. It's part of the reason that I started these webinars was to be able to talk to other people, because, you know, the lockdown and all the rest of it. But at the same time, I look forward to these presentations because I have to prepare for them. I have to think through some ideas that sometimes I haven't thought through enough. And to prepare for these webinars, which I take seriously, I'm forced to think through things, think them through carefully, you know, considerately. And that's what I was able to do with this material because of you guys. So I want to thank you. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.